Welcome to our Seasteading Social about the Constitution of Consent. Our guest is Max Borders. He is the founder and executive director of Social Evolution, a nonprofit organization dedicated to liberating humanity through innovation. His books include Underthrow, The Decentralist, The Social Singularity, and After Collapse. He also has a Substack newsletter called The Underthrow. Welcome, Max.
Thank you.
So, Max, you hosted a contest on the Constitution of Consent. So, can we start out just by talking about what does that mean? Why is consent in that term, and sort of the overall idea of behind having a Constitution of Consent?
Sure. Let me start with the second part first, and maybe that'll so we can click out an order of magnitude here and to the sort of the most macro level of what I'm up to. I think there's a multi-pronged effort. It needs to be a multi-pronged effort, and I'll go back to the Constitution of Consent in a moment. So for me, it's the legal innovation / innovation part. And then on the other hand, it's the moral cultural. Okay. The moral cultural is the why, or as Balaji Srinivasan would argue, it's the one commandment. So the idea of the network state, for example, you got to have something behind that to which people are committed. They're committed to a doctrine, or for lack of a better word, a dogma. That doesn't mean to be dogmatist. It just means a set of opinions that cluster together people can find themselves in that orbit, right? Now, on the other hand, there are innovations like the stuff that Seasteading Institute and associated organizations are working on. How you get this? How do you build a platform? What sort of legal systems are going to work in these contexts, and so on? And it's not always idealistic. In fact, it almost never is ideological or idealistic. And yet we need that sort of background. We need that locus point, that center of gravity for what is the moral cultural, I guess you could say. So where that comes together, the convergence of those two factors, the moral cultural on the one hand and the legal innovations on the other, is an important first project for this, I guess you could say, vision of the future. And that is the Constitution of Consent. Most constitutions are, even if they're sort of, if they're made in such a way that they become more liberal relative to institutional substrata of the past, they're still, they're imposed. They're an artifact of conquest and somebody making the rules that ain't you. And you can talk about people voting and crying their teardrop in the ocean and expecting the tide to turn, and you might be lucky enough to be born in some jurisdiction where the rules are more or less enforced, but most people aren't so lucky as to be born into some sort of constitutional republic, and where that constitutional republic's power structure honors the auspices that it was meant to engender with that constitution. So this is going back to the idea of consent, which in Locke or in Hobbes is not a a tacit, this notion of a hypothetical way of consent to something. But I want to go all the way back to good old contract law, that the idea that two or more parties have a meeting of the minds. And I love the common law in particular because it jives with so many of my sensibilities. The law of torts is basically, how have you injured someone in their person or their property? This is all very Lockean. This is all very common law, Anglo-Saxon common law. And for my listeners out, for those who are listening to us out there who are into, Code Civil and statute law, my apologies, but the sort of bottom-up law of the Lex Mercatoria or of the English common law is, in my view, a superior form of law. And yet here I am trying to get people to create the ultimate statute. Yet it's not a statute. The Constitution of Consent would be a multilateral contract. So it's kind of a fusion of the ideas. It's really a way of shaping or determining from the outset that you're going to be opting into a system that's going to use certain kinds of law, and that be enforceable in some way. And I'll leave it at that for a moment, and we can go down to various rabbit trails if it seems interesting.
Right. So I think you kind of touched on it, but I'd like to explore this a bit more. So on the Underthrow, you've written a couple times about the constitution of consent, talking about a real social contract, right? And that phrase stands out. So yeah, if you could expand a little bit, like what is a real social contract?
Well, sure. So we can imagine, Locke's social contract or anyone else's social contract in the common parlance is basically, this is whatever we vote for, that voting is consent. And if you have voted 100 times in your life and your representative or whatever the referendum is has never been executed, have you really consented to anything? And this is a common libertarian trope. I think it goes all the way back to Lysander Spooner, the great anarchist thinker of the 19th century, who was basically saying, I never signed up for any of this, including the US Constitution. We have to count on some Leviathan power to enforce it, a monopoly, and a forced monopoly. And so I'm looking at this not just from the question of justice, like, okay, this is better than the interest of the stronger. And I'm coming from American perspective because I'm American, but this project is meant to be cosmopolitan. It's not meant to be globalist in the sense of some sort of global body that is meant to enforce this thing. It is rather meant to be paving the way in some sense from a legal standpoint and of a moral standpoint of what Srinivasan would call the network state, which is that we connect with people who are of like minds. We agree to our own laws by opting into them, right? So it's Hirschman's exit, voice, and loyalty dynamic. We are expressing our loyalty to something, and in so doing, we have a right of exit, but we also have a responsibility to the obligations of being a signatory. That is a very different kind of relationship than the relationship of a citizen or a subject to a king or a constitution that was made by people who were more powerful than you. And so it's egalitarian in the sense of true equality before the law, but it's not egalitarian in the sense of equality of outcome and so on.
Well, so
Yeah.
what I'm imagining, like on a seastead, it seems very easy to sort of set this up, and tell me if you disagree. But a seastead, it's an artificial floating structure, and there's a very clear point of being on the seastead versus being off the seastead. And so you have a point of entry where you can really have your sit down and go over your social contract and say, you are entering onto the seastead, and these are our rules of engagement, these are our policies. Let us know if you make sure you understand and agree, and so that onboarding and offboarding is a very physical, tangible event when participating with the seastead community. And I mean, there may be some aspects of living on the water that I haven't considered, but that would sort of diffuse that clarity. But how do you see this working, not on a seastead? Like, how do you make sure that consent is informed and not under duress, I should say?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways of looking at it, okay? And some of the questions are not going to be able to be answered simply because this is going to require iteration cycles, it's going to require tests and so on. But if you think about let's call it, let's just imagine a seasteading platform, okay, that is a single unit that has its own rules. But we can also imagine that seasteading platform having relationships with other seasteading platforms. So we have a subsidiarity layer of a legal stack, okay? Excuse me. So the legal stack is what we might call similar, but not exactly the same as in the EU or the United States. These are, of course, not the same exactly. There's tighter couplings in the United States and looser couplings with the EU, for example, because of Brexit. Is Brexit, something like Brexit possible here? I sure as hell hope so, but unlikely, right? We'll see. But the idea is that there are subsidiary layers of nested law, right? So a single platform might have very specific rules, like you can't get, you must stay 6 feet away from the side because the side, because there's a rail that's too low or something like that. The idea is the application of local knowledge is going to be very important in a subsidiary way. But there might be some big picture things in terms of moral cultural commitments that those who are doing business and living on any given one of these networked platforms may want a superstratum of law, right? And that superstratum would be designed to spawn new subsidiary jurisdictions. So going back to answering your question in another way, there's an article that I gave to folks who were entering the contest called Pillars of Constitutional Design. Okay. And one of those pillars is called Panarchy. Panarchy is basically, if you've got folks out there who've ever read Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia, part 3 had a vision for Panarchy. But Panarchy was first dreamed up, at least to my knowledge, by a fellow named Paul-Émile Dupuit. Dupuit being a Belgian liberal, okay? A Belgian liberal of the, where in 1860 wrote this treatise called Panarchy. And he's trying to get us to imagine in Panarchy. So this is a different article from the one I'm talking about, but yeah, that's the one. Okay. So you see number 5, Panarchy, is the idea that you would be able to select in some sense, whether through your physical body or not, the law under which you want to live. And adjudication between and among jurisdictions would happen very much as they do now with either common law courts, international courts. International business law is carried out in more or less that way. So if I'm in Dubai and someone else is in Singapore and we're doing business with each other, there are legal mechanisms for settling disputes. Usually they have to do with signatories saying, hey, we're going to settle this in some sort of arbitration court. But the idea here is that the Constitution of Consent would be a more superordinate proto-network state body of law, right? That would allow for more subsidiary jurisdictions to be spawned. And you could be either a signatory to one of those physical jurisdictions, or you could also sign up for other kinds of arrangements. Like, let's say that I'm not some sort of rabid anarchist all the way down, that locally I really am okay about living in some sort of intentional community where we share a certain number of resources and redistribute them. And the redistribution, it happens by certain mechanisms that we all opt in together. So that could be weaving the welfare state, as the social safety net, right? Weaving it together in mutual aid. So more Kropotkin than anything, right? But that's okay, because at the highest level, the Constitution of Consent is going to say that's something that should be done at a lower level of subsidiarity. Whether or not that's on terra firma, that might be something that we do together via some sort of DAO. So everybody here, we might have, let's say, seasteading fans mutual aid DAO. And we may decide at some future time that we want to look out for each other. One of us loses a job, probably me, because what the hell is good as a philosopher in the future, right? Is going to come and say, well, we're going to help Max out. He can be our resident philosopher for 6 months. He can have some income while he finds a job waiting tables. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Just in case maybe he can find a job as a philosopher or someone who does this kind of shit. And we have locked arms in solidarity at a lower level, so to speak, in terms of the legal stack. We have locked arms in solidarity and inked a contract together. But we've also inked a multilateral contract at the highest level, as it were, which is the Constitution of Consent. And we've agreed to arbitration. We've agreed to whatever enforcement mechanisms would make that possible, even if it's that you are no longer able to do business because you have sullied your reputation. Those mechanisms are not altogether clear. And that is one of the things about the constitutional consent contest that we really wanted to see more of, right? Is some of these questions. We had tremendous number of, and one of the winners is on the call right now. The winnings were split, and Alexander Voss was one of the winners. Did a great job. But really, the Constitution of Consent contest was a mechanism for answering some of these questions that are still sort of outstanding. Because in a lot of ways, it's about getting to a 1.0, something that you can begin to have iteration cycles on. And you can start to have forks, you can start to have updates, much in the manner of law. Because in this way, we're thinking of law as being like open source code.
Right. Now, I think that's very important for seasteaders to remember that it is about the experimentation. It's about testing and seeing what works in practice. There's a very big temptation for us to sort of daydream and imagine what the ideal society will look like and how we'll create the rules to do it. But it doesn't. We have to make sure that it actually works. And so I like the idea of considering, like, in the formation of a governance structure, you're incorporating the idea that this will grow and change as people's needs change. And we don't expect these rules written on this contract to be etched in stone and forever applicable to our society. I mean, that was one of my questions about, because Max, especially your books that I mentioned early on talk about many different ways of looking at how governance can work. And I had a moment of cognitive dissonance, because the idea of a constitution, these rules that are written down, humans are so creative, we will always find loopholes. So having a constitution that incorporates there will be loopholes, or like how to adjust to those creative human impulses. I mean, do you have any comments on that specifically?
Well, and this is why I started the conversation out, and I insisted on going back to the idea that a moral cultural substrate is part and parcel to this, right? So remember, on the one hand, I said we need a moral cultural set of commitments, or Balaji Srinivasan in his network state blueprint. It's like a manual, how-to manual for doing this, right? And in some sense, I think it's an important piece for everyone to look at if you haven't already. But he has the one commandment. You've got to have the moral core. If you don't have a moral core, you don't have anything people are willing to live or die for. If you don't have anything people are willing to live or die for, they're not sure as hell not going to be willing to protect it. And they're going to be willing to try to game the system to advantage themselves. These sociopaths always exist in this world. And that's why a lot of people think this is all about default Hobbesianism, that all we can ever do in the world is have a supremely Hobbesian Leviathan power and oblige that Leviathan power to be wise and good. Well, with that much power, we know what happens because we've all read The Lord of the Rings, right?
Or seen the movies, right?
Yeah, so the idea of this is, if it's possible to set up a number of little niches, a bunch of little niches everywhere we can think of, whether that's, Tipolis working on little projects where, parts of the world where they're establishing private cities, whether that's the Seasteading Institute providing some sort of technical assistance for getting seasteads set up off the coast of whatever jurisdictions under certain flags, whether that is Prospera, whether it's Singapore, whether it's, and so on. You have more opportunities. When you have more opportunities for exit, and they're competing for members, especially if you can compete for members in the cloud, that's great. Because sometimes it's just about setting up a business. Okay, yeah, I might have to pay my taxes in the United States, but my business is a part of the Estonian business law, because I've set up a corporation under Estonian law. So we're starting to decouple this notion of laws and territory and have a little bit more of this idea of open source law already. In that sense, Estonia is quasi open source law. And Tom W. Bell's ULEX is another example where people, it's like, hey, if you want to grab a little bit of common law, you want to strip out all the BS, it's basically Delaware common law for commercial code. This is all, it's not perfect, but it's good stuff. But when you have all of these competing jurisdictions, the more of them you have, the more difficult it is, in some sense, for Leviathan powers to enjoy global domination. There are new stable equilibria forming. It's the old idea of concentrated benefits, dispersed costs from Mansur Olson. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but the idea is it reverses that. Concentrated benefits, dispersed costs is like, why are people rationally ignorant about all the stuff, the shenanigans going on in Congress? Nobody knows anything, whether it's mohair subsidies or how much money goes to national defense or whatever. Nobody knows. They can't know. It's irrational for them to be able to know or to take the time to find out. And nevertheless, they vote, right? And so who wins in this regard are special interests. The interests are concentrated, the benefits are concentrated on those interests. And the costs of enforcement are diffuse. That is to say, no given one of us has the ability to enforce it, and they get away with murder all the time. This is why our empire, the US empire, is teetering. And I think the Chinese empire is in the same process right now. It's become too top heavy. It's become too costly to enforce everything around the world.
Do you think there's a maximum capacity for one jurisdiction?
Yeah, I do. I think there's a theoretical problem. I think this is we've seen this through cycles of empire over and over again. Part of it has to do with the good old Sir John Glubb, the old British military strategist who oversaw the development of Jordan, the region as it, after the World War II. And he basically talks about these cycles where you start off as very pioneering and you get very entrepreneurial, then you get wealthy, and then you get slack, and then you start wanting more and more welfare benefits, and then you then you invite or allow all of these different people to come from all over these other jurisdictions, and you sort of get this unraveling as the imperial power tries to draw more and more resources from the rest of the world, but has to invest in predation to do so. And then it gets to a point where it can't. But there's also a complexity transition. So it's not just the information problems or the financial problems of managing an empire. The US empire right now is in $34 trillion debt with unfunded liabilities bigger than the entire economic output of the planet. Actually, it's just how much we don't know. The uncertainty of the unfunded liabilities into the future is bigger than the economic output of the entire planet. So that's how much debt the United States is swimming in. China's got similar problems. We also have a demographic collapse coming. So all these factors, financially speaking, that make it very, very difficult for these large powers to maintain their global control. But there's also information problems. The way, if you don't transition from a hierarchical state of affairs where information travels up and down chain of commands, right, in a command and control hierarchy, if it doesn't transition to a network state of affairs, which distributes power more evenly among nodes in the network, you're going to have collapse that way, as that top-down structure, that command and control structure, either has to hybridize or become a network, or it collapses.
Mm-hmm.
And so the dynamics of these imperial cycles, we've seen it over and over again around the world. Now, technology, of course, technology is a kind of tool, right? And what those tools are, like a steak knife is a really good tool for cutting your steak, but a steak knife can also be used to stab your spouse. Technology is the same way. As we go through the process of what I call subversive innovation, we will also see predatory innovation. So the future could be dystopia or a collection of utopias in competition. Of course, that latter vision is what I'm going for.
Sure. Well, I mean, this idea that if you have, well, panarchy. So from what I understand about panarchy, that was the ideal for the United States, having multiple states with a certain level of sovereignty, so there could be experimentation in different kinds of laws. But the United States has become an empire. So how does the Constitution of Consent avoid the same fate as the United States? Or is my idea about the origin of the United States off?
I don't think, I mean, I think the laboratories of experimentation idea was present in the minds of the founders before the progressive jurist whose name escapes me. Anyway, and then the laboratories of experimentation idea was a progressive jurist who was responsible for actually creating the central bank in the United States. Nevertheless, the idea is sound, right? Is that we could try different things and that's okay. You want to be able to maximize that experimentation because you want the dynamics of exit to create more stable equilibria in time, right? Which is why something like a Switzerland or a Liechtenstein has been quite successful in creating stable equilibria, because the way they do things is they want to attract and retain customers. They're so small, it's easy to defect. It's easy to just leave. So if the competitive forces are such that there's migration patterns, or nomadology, if you like, where the dynamics of no digital nomads and the membranics between and among these competing systems is much more robust than what we have now, which is what seasteading would give us, which is what these new jurisdictions like the ZEDEs in Honduras would give us, a more pronounced federal system in the United States would give us. And it still does, even though it's more tightly coupled to the federal government. We still have a lot of patterns in the United States where people move between and among jurisdictions for arbitrage reasons, if not also weather and ideology, right? So the more of this you have, the more difficult it is to be a tyrant, because you're raising the cost of predation by your very existence. And I call this subversive innovation. So what I'm trying to do with the Constitution of Consent is make it a proto body of law, or a way of imagining both a multilateral contract that people would sign that is different in the sense that all you have to do is vote with your feet. If after a time you are not satisfied with the benefits of being a signatory to those auspices, after a year's time, you may say, nope, not signing back up. So you lose my contribution to that effort, right? Because that may come with money. It may come with other kinds of benefits that if you withdraw, right, there will still be network effects, because maybe I like the way you are protecting my business interests. I like the way you have nice common law judges. I like the way you're not using, regulatory hammer on my business or my person. And in that sense, I become a signatory. But that's the difference between panarchy and federalism. Federalism, you literally have to say, okay, there's a conquered jurisdiction here with a set of laws on it. I have to leave that jurisdiction with my feet and my crap and go to another one. That's still better than nothing. But with panarchy, it's law is in the cloud. It is much more pure open source law. And I might have something like a certain amount of money sitting in the what's it called? Old age brain. When two parties have monies sitting somewhere in a bank, right? And then if one of the parties does not honor his or her side of the agreement, it comes out of it.
I'm sorry, I'm
Escrow. Thank you, Jeremy. Yes, escrow. But what this looks like, these ways of establishing these network effects and holding signatories to account for their specific contributions to it, creating these network effects outside of the coercive apparatus of the state, is going to create a very different set of dynamics. But I believe if you're holding people together and they're cohering because of benefit rather than because of sticks, rather than or carrots rather than sticks, you're going to get far better dynamics.
Mm-hmm. So I do want to open up the conversation to our audience. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask directly. But I had another question about, so we've talked a little bit about reducing tyranny at a large scale, but does this open up small tyrannies, right? I mean, if you've been to a contentious school board meeting, you may know what I'm referring to. But
Absolutely.
yeah, so yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, there will never, this is the funniest thing. I hope this crowd will forgive me for my ideological priors. My ideological priors are an anarchist, right? That is the complete diminishment of the threat of violence from one person to another or one group to another anywhere in the world, living only by commitment to rules, right? So we could say that is the ideal state. But so when I hear these libertarians and these anarchists arguing about, oh, which is better? Oh, libertarianism is better. Oh, anarchism is better. It's almost like it's like two people arguing about which of their ideological glass sculptures hanging on skyhooks is better. It's like, who gives a shit? Nobody can use an ideological glass sculpture hanging on a skyhook.
Right.
How are we going to get there is the question. And that is, in that sense, it's like, okay, we have to think, and so I call my doctrine asymptotic anarchy. And I'm no math person, but as far as I know, an asymptote is a curve that approaches some sort of line or axis or infinity or something like that. It gets closer and closer, but it never actually gets there. And I kind of see these efforts in that way. The idea of trying to get people like us in a moral cultural orbit with one another to create these miniature jurisdictions and do things quietly and peacefully and have commercial relationships and build culture and do all this stuff, hopefully outside the auspices of Leviathan powers, is the way forward. We criticize by creating. Now, that's not to say we're not going to have petty local tyrants. I live in a homeowners association. As of 6 months, I just bought a house and I'm scared to death of all the stuff that's likely to happen just in my neighborhood.
Right. You have to have eternal vigilance for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to get on the board and control it like a normal.
Right. And so then I'm playing politics.
Yeah.
But the idea here is, to the extent
a mess.
possible, is to raise the cost of making politics fruitful and reduce the costs of making switching possible and making collaboration possible, increasing predation costs, reducing exit costs, and reducing transactions costs. That's really the essence of how I view all of this stuff in terms of legal innovations. And sometimes you've got to make pragmatic trade-offs. Alex,
Amen.
one of the winners, works in the space. He knows about this. Joe Quirk, who's usually, I'm sure, with you guys, knows about this after having to try to hammer out agreements with some of these jurisdictions so that they can set up offshore outside of Micronesia or Polynesia or whatever. I mean, those efforts were abortive because this is really hard stuff. So the asymptotic anarchy it's sort of like, it's the North Star, but it's an emphasis on what are we going to do? And this is just another effort to try different things. First, to pull people together in a multicultural orbit. I mean, a cultural orbit, a common core, if you like, of doctrine, where people start to think in terms of law can be open source and rather than being terrestrial entirely. But it's also an effort to start some iteration cycles. Well, let's put it on GitHub or whatever the geeks use for their code, to start getting people noodling on these ideas. So the contest was really a means to get that started.
what I've noticed is in the space of innovation, it's like if you're going to disrupt something, that the system will go against you, right? So they just, it's because, not that the idea is not better. Um, it's simply that's how they've made their money for so long, right? And that's the problem, which I think we fight more regularly, is that when we try to innovate like this, stops are put in place because it is too efficient, right? And they've made money off of the inefficiencies. They've designed their products and services as a result of the inefficiencies. So when you create systems that are too efficient, it threatens them.
Yeah.
And they get in the way. And
Right.
and there's gatekeepers everywhere. And sometimes they don't even realize they're gatekeepers, because the status quo just is so important to them, right?
Yeah, and this is honestly, Josh, this is why I want to pick on our crypto friends for a moment, right?
Let's do it.
Because when Satoshi Nakamoto's original white paper is dripping with ideological priors, it's saying this is a monetary constitution of consent, right? It's not to say it's perfect. It's not to say it's going to be the be all end all. I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist. I'm not a Bitcoin maxi. I'm a Bitcoin mostly. Okay. But what that means is we have people operating in an evolutionary fitness landscape when they're developing these technologies. But from about 2017 to about 2021, we had a whole lot of people dicking off with NFTs. They weren't building the parallel institutions. Some people were working on DAOs. Some people were working on DeFi. Okay. A lot of those efforts failed, were abortive, got captured by financial interests. There were all sorts of other problems that crashed. Both the NFT world crashed and the DeFi world essentially crashed. And a lot of it has to do with that, the bad actors in the space. But that moral cultural core was not there for so much of that era of 2017 to 2021. And this is a never-ending process of trying to rid systems of bad actors, to try to figure out ways where you can reduce the cost of exit one system and move to another. This is all very pragmatic. As much as I'd like to be an idealist and say we should never take from each other, we should never use rules to take advantage, we should never, operate outside of integrity. The fact is that people do. What are we going to do about it? So it's almost like using ideological priors as pragmatic means to an end. Because if you create institutions that bad actors are going to use to take advantage of people, they're using people like timid herds around the world right now. That's how they view us. That's how the elite class views us. And I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but this has all been laid bare. If you're into seasteading, you know this. This is why we're doing this. It's not because we're trying to create places where rich people can go stash their money, although that's probably also true. That wouldn't hurt. But it's more a way of creating escape hatches for people to realize their conceptions of the good in communities with people who share their commitments. And Leviathan states don't do that. They force you to outsource your responsibilities to distant capitals, and they treat you like you're part of a timid herd. And so these kinds of experiments are ways of hastening what I call the social singularity, which is the point beyond which we lateralize our relationships enough such that new dynamics form around carrots rather than sticks, around collaboration, not compulsion. And that's the essence of this.
My greatest concern over the last few years in the crypto space is that as much as we weren't welcoming institutions, now the majority have, and with the hopes of the institutions bringing more wealth or value to their holdings, right? But I believe that the institutions, because they have more resources, have outpurchased and owned now the majority of what was supposed to be scarce. It's now scarce to us and in abundance to them. And it just feels like the same type of system in which we already have. Yeah. So I don't know how to, prevent that from happening in an ecosystem in which those that can come to the table with more and just buy up the majority of, like, I guess right now Bitcoin is like 99% owned by institution. The whales are always going to be able to manipulate the market, right? So at what point are any of these financial systems that we're being so creative with, how do we prevent them from being taken over by those that are already controlling their systems because they have so many resources to do so, right?
I don't know.
Yeah,
But we cannot stop.
exactly.
Otherwise, we're sinoformed. The whole world becomes sinoformed. In other words, we will all be living in a Chinese social credit system. So I wish I knew, Josh, but every day we have
a
to find
seasteading currency, right? And then somehow within that, because these smaller communities can create their own currencies, right? And then we have
competing currencies.
competing currencies, and then the like-minded that sign, they want to be part of this constitution that is aligned with seasteading per se, right? And then within that, it's its own currency, and then it can somewhat be managed, right? We can see the intention of the investor, and the intention is not to be part of the community, but simply just to buy a system in which is working and take control of it. I mean, that's the only way I see it working at a small level. You can't, what's happening at these larger levels, I don't know. I can't see how it will benefit the individual. It will always be taken by the institution.
The problem right now is that there are choke points with the on-ramps and off-ramps between fiat and digital.
Mm-hmm.
If there can ever be a point beyond which it is unnecessary, that on-ramps, off-ramps is unnecessary, it's at least for a while could be game over.
If we could transition, there's a specific question in the chat, but I think we should start talking about enumerated rights before we address that question. So you had a list of enumerated rights for the Constitution of Consent, which I will, can you see that now?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, and these were suggestions, not directives.
Sure. Okay, so there are 15. Now, when you're creating this list of 15 enumerated rights, were you winnowing down to 15? Was it hard to winnow down, or were you, what was that process like?
No, I mean, I had to winnow down because there's so many other things you can do, but it's sort of like saying, here are a bunch of examples as you try to come up with your own constitution, figure out where these go in the institutional stack, right? Interestingly, for example, a right of self-defense, which in the United States is the Second Amendment, in other parts of the world, they don't have it. The funder of this, who gave the prize money, the primary funder, he was not into the Second Amendment. And so the question becomes, can you have a subsidiary jurisdiction, or is there a panarchic state of affairs where one would want to renounce their right of self-defense in order to be part of this jurisdiction? It's an interesting set of questions. It's not easy. The idealist in me is going to say, I never want to give up my right to defend my family. But defense is you can outsource that to a private concern. You can and hope that you're not paying that concern is going to if they start to become tyrannical or start to exercise their power in ways that are unseemly, that you would be able to take your money and run or whatever, that those competitive dynamics would work. But that's not always the case. And there's always going to be some guy who comes up in your yard or tries to rob your business or whatever. What are the associated rights? Gets to questions of idealism. The purpose of this contest was to see how can we have the most pragmatic structure that gives the most the greatest array of choices and still preserves some of the most basic aspects that are almost universal in the way we look at them. And this is where the idealism comes in. It's balancing the ideal with the pragmatic all the time.
So the specific question in the chat was, could you articulate a philosophy of anti-abuse law and accompanying law enforcement for a seastead community with an emphasis on response to highly sensitive and complicated crimes such as parental incest and subjugating intimate partner abuse?
No, I couldn't do that. I think that a lot of this kind of stuff is likely to be when any sort of jurisdiction is a signatory to law, that some sort of emergent law, that there would be laws on the books, many of which we may or may not want. But let's say that there's a uniform body of law of tort law, and that certain kinds of crimes like parental incest or whatever fall under that, and it can be proven that this is happening, then that there would be measures that this jurisdiction could take. But something like the Lex Mercatoria or Anglo-Saxon law, a lot of these are emergent forms. If you think that you're going to have a specific body of law or complete body of law in a single constitution, that just doesn't really work. It's almost like you got to say, no, we defer to the common law, and common law has this body of common law, and this body of common law has these provisions for and punishments for people who are aggressors or offenders in the tort sense. And tort laws have negligence. There might be emergent law involving parents and proper parenting. And there might be localized jurisdictions that have different things, just like in two different states on terra firma, you can be a criminal in one state by having sex with your 17-year-old girlfriend, and in the other, not being a criminal by having sex with your 17-year-old girlfriend, depending on where you're in. In one case, it's statutory rape, and in the other state, it's perfectly legit. So you're going to have these kind of problems with legal pluralism. Not everything can be instantiated as this great, timeless universal, but you can approximate that in the common law, because the common law, especially the law of torts, is based on injury. And if you can prove injury, in whether, and there's a criminal sense of there's criminal law, and then there's civil law in terms of injury and recompense. But all of these things can be iterated locally and then adopted by neighboring jurisdictions if they seem to be better or be a factor of case law. But I don't know what that looks like. I just want to unleash those forces of innovation. Does that make sense?
I would hope that those living within the area of those laws would know those laws, right? So they would act accordingly. So coming into it, they would be established, and they would know that they're what state they're in, like this, like the rape law in which you mentioned, 17 and 1 and above 17, or below 17 and 1 and above 17 the other type deal, is that then those that don't agree with that or have a 17-year-old partner wouldn't be living on that seastead, right? Because it causes trouble for them. So they would know that before going into it.
But there has to be an enforcement mechanism.
Right. Well, that could be as creative. And once again, if that's made very clear, right, then they understand it's no surprise to them when they break the rule that the enforcement is now following. And they've agreed to that enforcement, whatever it happens to be, right? So it's like, okay, that's if I do this, this is the result of it. And I've agreed to that by living here. And then it's enforced, and they really have no say on it at that point because they've agreed to live and participate in that community. So I don't know. I mean, I think as long as it's well communicated, if they don't want to abide by those things, then they can go live somewhere else.
And that's really the way it works now to a great degree. It's just de facto before it is de jure. This is introducing more pluralism, more variation, but the idea is that, you know, people with certain kinds of moral cultural commitments, the pioneers and the early folks, are going to, at least for a time, you know, Singapore, for example, has always had a pretty stable set of business laws, taxation levels, and so on. And they're an extremely healthy society in this regard. But when it comes to social freedoms or personal freedoms, they're hardcore. If they find you selling drugs, they'll put you to death. You got to make that trade-off if you go to Singapore. You know, if you're a burner and you want to have a burn, like a local burn in Singapore, probably a bad idea, right? And I'm not saying that's good. I like the idea that people should put things into their bodies if they want to, but there may be other more local jurisdictions where that could be spawned by this constitution where people keep that much more under wraps. You know, or like, yep, fentanyl's become such a problem that we're just going to put people to death if we find them selling it. What else are we going to do but create that incentive, that disincentive? I mean, they might decide that. I couldn't say. Now, there could be things higher up the stack that preclude that. You might say at the constitutional level, we have a complete moratorium on the death penalty at the highest level of the Constitution. But we don't know. That's the reason for the contest. What do these dynamics create? What do they look like? What are they likely to unleash? Because simple rules give rise to complex orders and even subsidiary jurisdictions. It's a very interesting and hard problem. And I have to tell you guys, it was really, really hard for me to promote the contest for this reason. Because a lot of people I'm promoting are Americans, and I'm like, yeah, but they were like, we don't need a new constitution. The one we have is good enough. We just need to enforce it. And I'm like, I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking to just you. And by the way, if you're such a patriot, go read the Declaration of Independence and what Jefferson had to say in that about the consent of the governed, because it was all a bunch of Trumpkins telling me how wrong I was, right? And then on the other side, I'm trying to promote to people who are not American and are not used to the sort of American style constitutional law with all of these things taken. And I'm sure that the seasteading community is filled with people from all over the world. And those are the people I'm trying to reach. And yet there are certain things that come out of Enlightenment thinking and Anglo-Saxon law that I'm very keen to preserve because they give rise to these kinds of structures. You know, I'm sorry to the French and to the Romans, but Roman law is crap.
I don't think you have to apologize to them.
Justinian law is shit. And, you know, and common law is a heck of a lot better.
There was a question in the chat, how to handle a rogue seastead. So like if a group starts a seastead that's run by pirates and they violate other seasteads' rights, how to handle this.
Yeah, that's a question for you, Carly.
I mean, I was looking back at those enumerated rights. It's the right of self-defense. It's, you know, if you violate a contract, I mean, it will be up to the seasteads to defend themselves. We hope to prevent that as much as possible by forming good relationships with neighbors. But just like there are always sociopaths in our community, there will probably always be criminal elements trying to steal. And I mean, any constitution has to sort of explain what your responsibilities on that seastead are. Like, do we call up a militia? You know, do you have a security force? You know, that will have to be.
Need some privateers.
Right, privateer.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So
do you have some sort of insurance plan that kicks in that everybody contributes to, and you have a mutual defense system that kicks in, and all the people who signed up for that, and it's like, nope, I've got proof, and you violated the law. We're going to drag you into our courts and maybe into our prisons, and you may have to pay us to get out of prison, or you may have to live in prison forever if you can't pay. But like, that's the way it happens anywhere. Even if you had private competitive policing and private competitive law, most people are going to reduce those costs by agreeing to arbitration at some point and
Is
having
that,
insurance companies behind it.
pri-
Those
pri-
equilibria are
private,
going to
is
come
that-
to
is
pass
that
whether you have a
wanting to-
monopoly or not.
like a bounty system, perhaps?
Yeah, those discussions had come up over the years as regards to like non-lethal sound wave security force with drone boats and flying drones and things like that. So we were getting creative with, you know, early detection systems on pirates coming in and systems being deployed to defend, but non-lethal, just deterrent systems where they got, you know, whoever's coming in was getting real uncomfortable in their skin, right? They and just couldn't come past a certain barrier, right? So as you know, we can get as creative as we want without having to you know, finish someone's life. So.
Well, and this is a good question for me, and I can't answer it because I'm always trying to solve the Hobbesian problem, right? What I would call the Hobbesian problem, which is, let's say that this constitution of consent has no universal enforcement mechanism, okay? Right? It doesn't have a big standing army or big FBI style police force that can be corrupted. You don't want that. But on the other hand, if you don't have that, what's to make any of these very strong subsidiary jurisdictions to say, what the hell are you going to do about it? We're strong. Right? So then you have to hope that whatever it is the dynamics between and among these different jurisdictions and their armies, such that it's more costly. It's more costly to go to war than it is to cooperate and pay what you ought to. It's more costly to be on the run on the sea than it is to, you know, honor your commitments and so on. It's always a set of economic trade-offs at the end of the day. And this is a puzzling predicament about I call it the problem of power. And, you know, at the end of the day, if you have more choices, it's harder for power to keep you under its cloven hoof. But it's not a foolproof. It's just one way of checking it.
Well, to wrap up our conversation today, would you give your, we'll say instructions to seasteaders? What are your instructions to seasteaders for what we can do with this constitution of consent?
I would say what you can do with it is dream big. The process isn't over. I think we might have lost Alexander Voss at some point. I don't know if he's still around, but you know, Alexander was the winner, and he's got a set of great ideas. Our other winners have a great set of ideas. These guys are going to have a great set of ideas. This is an innovation and entrepreneurship problem as much as it is an ideological problem. And so the more we start thinking about this, I want to encourage you to be in touch with me at underthrow.org. For one thing, you can sign up for my Substack, but that's also a way of just being in touch with me. I get the benefit of having you read my shit every day, which is great. But it's also, you know, you can reach out to me and ask questions, and we can collaborate, and the community can grow there. Also, obviously, being in touch with Carly and Joe at the Seasteading Institute, maintaining these communities so that this kind of cross-fertilization of ideas can continue to happen. I'm not going to sit here and say that I have the be-all, the tablets of Moses when it comes to this Constitution. I'm trying to get people who are a hell of a lot smarter than me to continue tinkering with this thing until we have something that people go, wow, this could really work. And then we move to an implementation phase.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Max, for joining us today. And thank you everyone else who joined the conversation. And hope to see you at a future event.
Thank you for having me, guys. I really appreciate everybody.
Yeah, likewise, Max. Thank you. Thank you.